If you are looking for the easiest way to compost at home, then you're going to want to try this. Let me tell you why. Hey, Nadia here, and I want to talk about why I think this is the easiest way for you to get started composting at home. But easy is obviously relative, so let me talk about why I think this is easier over some of the other types of composting. It's not necessarily better, it kind of depends what your objectives are. So I'm going to talk about the different types of ways that you can compost and why you might want to try one or the other. And I'll also talk about this particular brand of compost tumbler, but I want to give you all the options so that you can make the decision that obviously is going to be best for you. All right, first off, let's talk about some of the other ways that you can compost, because like I said, this one's easy, but easy has to be compared to something, right? So the first main way I would say that you can compost is with a compost heap. So like just a big pile of scraps from your garden. I have one of these at home. I'll show you. This way of composting is like a heap or a compost pile or a compost bin. Some of the challenges though with this type of composting is that you can get like critters in here. So I've seen mice and maybe their voles in here. I know that I've heard people get rats in their compost. Thankfully I haven't had that problem, but you know, it's kind of icky, right? If you're turning your compost and like a rat runs out, which is gross. But the other thing is that it's heavy manual work to turn this type of compost. You do want to turn your compost, or with the compost tumbler, which I'm going to show you, you can just rotate it to turn it. But what that does is it allows it to decompose faster. Like the top materials, you kind of mix it in with the bottom. It creates heat, it just is what is going to compost faster. Now, you don't have to, right? Like nature will decompose all plants at some point. It just takes a lot longer if you don't turn it at all. So with a compost pile like this, you're going to want to do some sort of turning, and usually you're going to grab like a pitchfork or something and turn it around. So some of the reasons why you might want to use this is if you, let's say you live on a really big property, like if you're a homesteader or you have a really big garden, then you're definitely going to want to consider this option, especially if you want to be more self-sufficient and you don't want to buy your soil, right? Because if you don't compost at home, you're going to need to buy some soil. Otherwise, it's just harder to garden if you don't keep adding soil every year. So while I think this is a really effective option, you can get a ton of compost, right, with a compost heap, it's definitely not the easiest way. Like I wouldn't do this unless you are like gung-ho on composting and you want to learn about browns and greens and you're okay on like dealing with any sort of pests that might accumulate in here. And you're also willing to turn it. You're also willing to do the manual labor of actually turning your compost at least once a year. So those are some of the reasons why I don't think it's the easiest way. Like I said, I think it's a good way. It's just not the easiest way to compost. The other option to compost at home is vermicomposting or worm composting. And really what you do is you take a setup like this and you have worms inside, you feed them scraps, the worms eat the scraps, and then it turns into soil or worm castings. And while I absolutely love this approach, I don't necessarily think it's the easiest option to get started with. And the reason for that is that you're taking care of a living creature, right? A worm, but it's a living creature. So you do need to continually feed it. Like I can't just walk away from my worms for months or a year even and expect them to survive. Like I can walk away from my compost tumbler for as long as I want. I don't have to continually put food in there. It doesn't matter. It just nothing will happen. Here, if I don't actively take care of it, take care of the worms, they're going to die potentially. Other than that though, I love vermicomposting. If you want to learn more about this, I did a video with a couple, I think earlier this year. Really good, super informative video. They're much more knowledgeable than I am about vermicomposting. So if you want to learn more about that, you can watch that video if you want to learn more about this. But as far as the easiest, this video is talking about the easiest method, right? I do think that a compost tumbler is easier than worm composting, even though I don't necessarily think it's better. I think they're both great, but it is easier. The other option you have is, let's say, doing indoor composting. So now you can put the worm compost bin indoors too. I find worms kind of icky. So I don't like to keep my worms inside my house, even though I know it's totally fine. Kathy totally convinced me in that video I was just talking about that worms are totally fine to keep inside your house, but I don't. And I find they're okay here in my greenhouse or otherwise like in a garage or something, just in the winter so that they don't freeze. But there are actual ways that you can compost indoors in your house as well. I know Vitamix makes a indoor composter. I haven't tried it, although I really do want to. So if you have, let's say, like a small yard, maybe you live in a townhouse or you don't even have a yard, like maybe you have a balcony garden, that would probably be a really good option I would consider. I can't say that it's easier or harder than the compost tumbler because I've never tried it before. But as far as the more traditional outdoor composting methods, I definitely think the compost tumbler is going to be the easiest, best bet, especially if you're a beginner. So let me show you some of the features that I really like about it. All right, so the first thing that I like, now just so you know, this is the brand of that makes this is Jora or Jora Form. I don't know if they go by Jora Form anymore. I looked it up and I saw they were called Jora now, so I don't know, Jora or Jora Form. And the reason I chose this one, I actually chose it based off of another YouTuber. Now I bought this back in 2014. Okay, so this composter right here is almost 7 years old. I bought it in March of 2014. I looked online at the store I bought it from. It's cool, right? You buy things online, you can pull up your receipt from 7 years ago. And the reason that I chose this one is for a few reasons. The first one being that it is made out of metal. So a lot of the other ones that I had seen on the market were plastic, and I did see some other YouTubers at the time. Now I can't talk about the quality of plastic tumbler composters now. This is a tumbler, so it turns, right? And I had heard some of those other YouTubers talking about the fact that their plastic composters were splitting. Their tumbling composters split or they broke open and then it fell all over the place. And I have no patience for like cheaply made products, certainly not gardening products, because like you're putting them to the test, right? I had a weeder. I had the hardest time finding a weeder for my garden that didn't keep snapping. Like the handle kept snapping off, and it was like, guys, make it, like I'm using it in the garden, so make it good quality. So I wanted one that was going to be well made. I didn't want to have a huge big plastic composter that I was just going to throw in the garbage. So I like that this one is made out of metal. The other thing that's really nice about it is if you open it, and it's just got these clasps on the top, the inside actually has a really thick layer of foam. And the reason why that's so helpful with this particular brand, I don't know if any other compost, I'm not comparing it necessarily to other compost tumblers because I haven't tried them, but the reason why I chose this one was because it has this thick layer of foam. And when you're composting, you want it to get hot inside of there. And I live in a cold climate, I live in Canada, so I wanted, we have our cold winters here, and I didn't want to necessarily have to stop composting when it got cold, or even in the spring and the fall. Like I wanted to keep actively composting. And the reason why this one is so great is that with this foam, it actually keeps the inside of my compost hot. And what that does is it lets the materials, the plant matter inside, decompose faster. So the combination of turning it, of rotating it, and this insulation actually creates compost in apparently as little as a month. I don't think I've ever had it that fast, but like 2 months usually, maybe 3 if it's really cold, but I can get compost. And you compare that to like a compost heap, you're waiting at least a year usually, maybe longer, to actually get your compost from it. So this one you can keep adding. It's got 2 sides that you can open up, and you add all the plant matter to the one side. Once it's full, you stop adding it to that side, and then you add it to the other side. And by the time you filled up the second side, theoretically, this first side should be done. It should all be turned into compost. Now it depends how fast you're adding it. So really all you're doing with this is you are just throwing scraps in, rotating it every time you put scraps in, so usually like every few days or so. And then when one side is full, you stop filling up that side, and then you fill up the other side. And once you filled up the other side, theoretically, the first side should be already composted. And then all you do is you just dump it out. Now, the really nice thing about this is you can just put a bucket underneath and dump out the compost. And then I'm ready to start filling up that side again. And it's worked out really well for me. So I really particularly love this brand. 7 years, I can tell you that it is still standing. It's certainly starting to rust in some places. But, I think everything rusts if it's outdoors in the elements for 7 years, right? You think about a car is going to start rusting after 5 or 6 years, and that's $20,000, $40,000, $60,000, right? So my couple $100 for my compost tumbler, the fact that it's still standing, I would expect I could easily get a few more years out of it. And it's just got a little bit of rust. It's still creating really good compost. I love it. So that's why I like this brand. And you can see, I can just turn it really easily, right? So you don't have to be really strong, right, to be able to turn one of these. I think if you got one of the really big ones, that they sold, it would probably be harder to turn, but this size, I think most people should be able to turn this compost. Not everyone, but it's not super heavy. Like for you to get a pitchfork into a compost heap and turn it is a lot more effort. This is very, very easy to turn. And the other reason I love it, which I wouldn't have known until time had passed, is that obviously it's durable. 7 years later, it's still standing, but I've moved it. So I used to live in a different house and I moved this with me, and it was already, I didn't know I owned this for 7 years. We've lived here for 4 years, so this was already 3 years old or so by the time I moved. So it was a 3-year-old composter. I moved it to a new house, and then I've moved it around this property many times. So, and it's perfectly solid structure. So as far as durability, I can tell you, I don't know how it compares necessarily to some of the other compost tumblers, but this one in particular, it's a Jora Compost Tumbler, if you're going to look it up. I'll have a link to if you want to read more about it and where I bought it from. But this compost tumbler has definitely stood the test of time. If you look at the cost, even just like over the years that I've had it, it's pretty inexpensive versus something that might have broke after a year or two that was cheaper. Probably the yearly cost of this is the same, if maybe even less for this one. The other reason I really like compost tumblers is that they have these air ventilations on the outside, and this allows for airflow so it doesn't get really stinky, because sometimes compost can get smelly. And by turning it, you still need to get your browns and your greens, so you can't be just only throwing like vegetable scraps in there. You have to have some sort of brown matter. But one one trick I'll tell you is I heard this, I think from the same guy, the same YouTuber. I think it was probably Learn Organic Garden, Growing Your Greens. I watched a ton of his videos when I was starting gardening, and I know he still has a YouTube channel. He's huge YouTube channel. And I think I learned this from him, and he had said to use wood chip pellets, which I thought was a great idea. So I've actually tried that a few times. I don't use them all the time, but I have got wood chip pellets. If I don't have any sort of brown, like if I don't have leaves or dried grass or twigs or anything like that I could throw in here, then I will throw wood chips in there, and that has worked really well to keep it from kind of getting stinky. So that's a tip for you. You can just keep a bin of it somewhere and throw them in. But I love too that, remember how I said with the heap, the compost heap, that you can get critters? You're not going to get anything in here. So you don't really have to worry about opening it up and seeing like a rat or seeing some other critter in there, right? So, those are some of the reasons why I think a compost tumbler is one of your best bets if you're just getting into composting. But I also hope I shed some light into some of the other options, some of the other composting options, so that you can kind of see for yourself which one is going to be better. So I certainly like all the different composting methods, but as far as ease, if you're looking for something easy, this is definitely my recommendation. If you have any questions or any recommendations on your favorite type of composter, let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, I will see you in the next one.